I have never seen a man who deserved flame emojis around his head during an interview. And no, not for the reasons you might be thinking. That's mean. Flame emojis for getting sizzled and for melting down during an MSNBC, massive shit news broadcasting corporation. Dude was melting down during Friendlies interviewing him because he's got no good excuse for the disaster that is his state of Minnesota. Do we play the cropped out version? No, I want to play the cropped in version because you don't really need to see what the woman interviewing him saying, but I'll pull that up in any of it. I zoomed in on Tim Walz's face. Add flame emojis around his head like Mayor Quimby when he was being, he was doing a debate and he was like, they're asking him hard questions and, and it said flame emojis added by News 5. Listen to this.
Dozens of people of East African descent have been charged, convicted, and sentenced for stealing more than $1 billion in taxpayer money from government programs during COVID. As you know, Governor, that is more than Minnesota spends each year to run its Department of Corrections. So I want to give you a chance to respond to this. Do you take responsibility for failing to stop this fraud in your state? Dozens of people of East African descent have been charged.
It almost looks like AI idiot. Like make an automated idiot, and that name would be Tampon Tim No Balls Walz. Now hold on a second. Let me just play you the entire clip, which includes the response. Look at
Dozens of people of East African descent have been charged, convicted, and sentenced for stealing more than $1 billion in taxpayer money from government programs during COVID. As you know, Governor, that is more than Minnesota spends each year to run its Department of Corrections. So I want to give you a chance to.
I just have to say, $1 billion stolen, fraud, but East African descent. They don't want to say Somalian. They keep it as opaque as possible and still add flame emojis to a man who's getting roasted during an interview with Meet the Press MSNBC.
Respond to this. Do you take responsibility for failing to stop this fraud in your state?
Well, certainly I take responsibility for putting people in jail. Governors don't get to just talk theoretically. We have to solve problems. And I will note, it's not just Somalis. Minnesota is a generous state.
Do you know what's funny? She didn't say Somalis in that question. She said East Africans. Methinks thou dost protest too much, Mr. Walz. It's not just Somalis. She didn't say Somalis in that question.
Prosperous states, a well-run state, we're AAA bond rated, but that attracts criminals. Those people are going to jail. We're doing everything we can, but to demonize an entire community on the actions of a few, it's lazy.
To demonize an entire, first of all, no one demonized an entire community. They just noticed some statistical anomalies. What I like to refer to as statistical overrepresentations that cannot be ignored. What's amazing is when the statistical overrepresentation is a thing that people like, they tout it as an element of success. When it's not, it becomes racist or anti-Semitic or whatever, bigoted. You know, they say, you know how many Nobel laureates are or were Jewish? Well, it's a lot of them. It's a statistical overrepresentation. All right. Well, in the field of science and intellect and arts, there's overrepresentation of members of the Jewish community. Oh, when you say that there's overrepresentation of Jews in media, politics, and Hollywood, well, then it becomes anti-Semitic. All right. You know, in certain sports, there's statistical overrepresentation for good. And then in certain bad statistics, there's statistical overrepresentation. That's bad. That's racist. How dare you? That was on, so maybe it wasn't MSNBC, it's NBC. I still don't actually fully know what the difference is between MSNBC and NBC. They sound like the same branches or whatever. If you didn't know what was going on, Tim Walz is getting lambasted in the New York Times. And some people are going to say, Viva, you think the New York Times is fake news? Why do you rely on it when they go after people that you don't like? When they have to report on something that runs contrary to their chosen preferred narrative, you can add more reliability to it, much in the same way when a witness makes an adverse, spontaneous, or even, calculated statement against their interests. You can place more evidence in that. You can place more weight in that statement. This is from the New York Times. Listen to this article. 14 minutes. Well, we're not going through the whole thing. How fraud has swamped Minnesota's social service system on Tim Walz's watch. Prosecutors say members of the Somali diaspora, a group with growing political power, were largely responsible. Oh, I'm sorry. So not exclusive, Timmy boy. Largely responsible. Statistical overrepresentation. I think they amount for 50% of the fraud. President Trump has drawn national attention to the scandal amid his crackdown on immigration. Yep. And by calling Tim Walz retarded. Look, first of all, I don't care if people use that word, unless you're actually talking about someone who is clinically mentally challenged. You don't call someone who has a mental disability retarded. Who you call retarded are people who are supposed to be normal functioning, allegedly intelligent people who act a fool. That is where you use the word retarded, imbecile, moron, idiot, jackass, stupid. And if you use any of those other words, but you feign moral outrage at the word retarded, congratulations, you're retarded. The fraud scandal that rattled Minnesota was staggering. Okay, here. Federal prosecutors have charged dozens of people with felonies, accusing them of stealing hundreds of millions of dollars from a government program meant to keep children fed during the COVID-19 pandemic. Behold the deliciousness and nutrient power of good red meat.
Oh, yeah. Not for you. Sorry, you can lick my fingers. Oh, yes, sorry, Bob.
How do
Yes.
you know how to cook it so well? It's just like instinct. I just know.
That is
Yes.
the most delicious thing I've ever tasted in my life. It's amazing.
Yes, it is. And you know what it is, people? It's steak from the Chicago Steak Company. Nothing beats the mouth-watering sizzle of a premium steak, especially when it's from Chicago Steak Company. Hand-selected, expertly aged. Whether it's a celebration or just craving the best, our USDA Prime and Wagyu beef will turn any meal into an unforgettable experience, packed with the care, flash frozen for freshness. Your steak arrives chef-worthy and ready to impress right to your front door, by the way, and it comes with dry ice, so you can actually have some science experiments with your kids after. Join thousands of satisfied steak lovers across the country. Order today. Taste the difference. Chicago Steak Company is an unbeatable offer exclusively for my viewers over here. You go to mychicagosteak.com/Viva and you'll receive 6 free petite ribeyes, that is small ribeyes, plus free shipping on orders of $229 or more. $240 value, absolutely free. This means tender, juicy steaks, deliciously seasoned with. Head over to mychicagosteak.com/Viva. Place your order. $229 or more. You get $240 in value, absolutely free. Link is in the description. Check it out. Thank you. The Chicago Steak Company. Over the last 5 years, law enforcement officials say fraud took root in pockets of Minnesota's Somali diaspora as scores of individuals made small fortunes by setting up companies that build state agencies for millions of dollars worth of social services that were never provided. You know what's amazing? Everybody knew it was happening at the time. And I can only say this mutatis mutandis from what went on in Canada. When the government started offering these COVID relief funds to corporations, people were setting up shell corporations. Everybody knew it, and everybody called it out at the time. But the more money you give out during times of crises, even if you know it's going to fraud, well, the more benevolent you feel as a benevolent, liberal, progressive Democrat. Outrage has swelled among Minnesotans, and fraud has turned into a potential political issue in a competitive campaign season. Government Tim Walz and fellow Democrats are being asked to explain how so much money was stolen on their watch, providing Republicans who hope to take back the governor's office in 2026 with a powerful line of attack. Let me just see something here. I want to just get to the word percentage. Percent. No, not 5%, because I got to use my fat fingers to do this. Prosecutors focused on Minneapolis nonprofit organization called Feeding Our Future, which has become a partner to dozens of local business that enrolled as feeding sites. State agencies reimbursed the group and its partners for invoices claiming to have fed tens of thousands of children. In reality, federal prosecutors said most of the meals were non-existent. Business owners spent the funds on luxury cars, houses, and even real estate projects abroad. I mean, you don't want to mention this because you might make people think badly of the Somalian community in general if the massively statistical overrepresentation in the fraud was perpetrated by even a small element of the Somali Minnesotan population. In one case, hundreds of providers were reimbursed for assistance they claimed to have provided to people at risk for homelessness, though federal authorities said services weren't provided. The program's annual cost ballooned to more than $104 million last year. Authorities said the budget projected a $2.6 million when it began in 2020. Unreal. In another program aimed to provide therapy for autistic children. Won't someone think of the autistic children? Prosecutors said providers recruited children in Minneapolis's Somali community, falsely certifying them as qualifying for autism treatment and paying their parents kickbacks for their cooperation. Did Tampon Tim No Balls Walz know about this, or did he didn't? This is one of those situations where damned if you do, damned if you don't. If you did know about it, you partook in fraud, jail. And if you didn't know about it, what the hell were you doing as governor? Wild. And when you appreciate it's in the New York Times, you understand how prevalent, how notorious it has to be for the New York Times now to risk turning Minnesota red. Feeding Our Future later sued the agency, which continued. A report by Minnesota's nonpartisan Office of the Legislative Auditor about the lapses that enabled the meals fraud later found that the threat of litigation and the negative press affected how state officials used their regulatory power. I'll stop there. I'm going to give everybody the article. I put out a tweet before going live today to the effect that, in the UK, politicians, authorities, and the media covered up decades of Pakistani men rape gangs because they were afraid of the political blowback it would cause on the Muslim Pakistani community in the UK. And there were a lot of them. They covered it up for decades because they didn't want to exacerbate racial tensions. That's the reality of what the UK government, politicians, authorities, and media did for decades. They let little white girls get raped by gangs of Pakistani Muslim men for decades because they didn't want to make bad press that might demonize a segment of the population, that might shed some light on the atrocious consequences of the politicians' national, international, domestic policy. And the media, well, they just get virtue signaling points also. You don't want to piss off the government that funds your services, that funds your operations. What we're witnessing in Minnesota right now is the exact same thing, mutatis mutandis. And if you don't know what that word means, it's Latin for meaning changed as appropriate to fit the circumstances. We're not talking about Pakistani men, Muslim grooming rape gangs. They call them grooming gangs. They were rape gangs. We're not talking about that yet or now, to be determined if that is going to be on the political forefront. Right now, what we're talking about is massive fraud committed by the Somalian community, which is largely imported into Minnesota. And the government, the media, and the participants didn't want to shed light on it because they didn't want to paint the Somali community in a bad light. They didn't want to exacerbate racial tensions. They didn't want to be called racist. And $1 billion later, more than what is required to run the incarceration system in Minnesota, if that's what I understood, Tampon Tim is up there, flaming emojis around his head, if you imagine them, trying to defend. We're now, in light of this problem of which I was largely well aware, we are now starting to prosecute and lock up people for things that were going on for the last 5 years, of which I was well aware. And when the Wall Street Journal, when the New York Times and NBC start turning on you, you're in deep shit. And whether or not we would have even known about it, I suspect we would have. Trump calling Tim Walz literally retarded seems to have set fire to what was a simmering brush fire that is now national and international news. And that is what's going on in Tampon Tim's, Minnesota.